When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February the 24th, 2022, some territories faced Moscow's aggression for the first time, while others had been illegally annexed or fought over since 2014. When Russia's full-scale invasion began, 7 regions felt the full force of Russian aggression. Of these, Crimea had been illegally annexed by Russia for the longest time, 8 years. And it's this territory that perhaps holds the key for victory, both for Ukraine, but also a chance for Russia to get out of its current situation. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is also available on popular podcast platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And if you enjoy the content, please consider supporting us by becoming a patron. We'll be adding exclusive content there from time to time, such as chats and FAQs and extended conversations with our amazing guests. Elina Beketova is a Democracy Fellow at the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA. She has experience of working as a journalist, editor, and TV anchor for news stations in Kharkiv and Kyiv. Elina is originally from Crimea. At CEPA, she has authored Behind the Lines, a project about the latest developments in the temporarily occupied and recently liberated territories of Ukraine. For that study, she interviewed a range of Ukrainian voices, from policymakers through to activists and officials. And of course, this is one of the subjects we're going to touch on in our conversation now. Well, Elina, I'm delighted to welcome you to the channel.
Oh, thank you so much, Jonathan, for inviting me.
Well, let's start off with the theme of that article you produced. And some areas like the Luhansk and Donetsk oblasts were already occupied by Russian forces, and in fact have had sort of 9 years of control, injection of sort of mafia-style kleptocracy, but also propaganda, haven't they? And I'm really fascinated to hear what effect that long-term control by Russia has on people's minds and behaviors compared to areas that were temporarily occupied and recently liberated, like Kherson.
Jonathan, thank you so much for this question. You know that it's very important that we have to understand that all these 7 regions have different situations, because as you have said, some of them were under occupation for many, many years. And people there who live, they are brainwashed by this Russian propaganda. So they don't have the access to Ukrainian television. They don't have access sometimes to any other websites except of the state controlled by Russia. So that is why, like imagine the person, he lives or she lives somewhere under occupation, and every day it's a lot of information from the Russian media, from the Russian propaganda media, and there is no opportunity to actually learn what is going on the rest of the territory. As you know, probably you talked with the people, and they like from the temporarily occupied territories or maybe from Ukraine, and they would tell you that in like many cases, there is like this psychological pressure when people are sad that Ukraine forgot about them, you know, and it's very hard. So a person is under occupation and he feels and he hears this information that Ukraine forgot him, like his state or her state forgot him, and it's a terrible thought, because that moment you're absolutely helpless. You can't do anything, and you are. I mean, it's a very terrible life, because we all understand that the rule of law doesn't work there. So it's just a person lives somewhere like in a bubble. That what is going on with all these temporarily occupied territories, especially those like Donetsk or Luhansk Oblast, which were occupied, or Crimea, which was illegally annexed. So that is, you know, it's the effects of it and the consequences of this Russian propaganda. We can probably, I mean, I interviewed, you probably saw the article, and as you know that, for instance, Kherson region, which faced the occupation for the first time, and Yuri Sobolevsky, who is the first deputy head of Kherson Oblast Council, he told me that the occupiers were heavily influenced by Russian propaganda, because when they tried to communicate with locals, they kept saying their fight was not with them. They would say they wanted to overthrow the criminal regime in Kyiv and then together with Ukrainians go to war against Europe, NATO and America. And he also said that there were people on the checkpoints, on the local checkpoints in Kherson Oblast who were from Lugansk or Donetsk Oblast, which were temporarily occupied. And he said that after the territory was occupied and a certain number of years had passed, they were so brainwashed that they actually took up arms and went to war against their own citizens. So this is the main problem that we see right now. The more territories are under occupation, the more consequences we will have later.
And that propaganda starts young, doesn't it? We saw last week the sort of military event in Moscow in the football stadium, and there were children, I think as young as sort of 5 or 6, all the way up to their teens. And these were children from Mariupol, whose parents may or may not be alive. The children may have been sort of, told that their parents either didn't want them or had passed away. And you see that sort of propagandistic and coercion working really from an exceptionally young age. And it's not just against Ukrainians, is it? I mean, we also see extensive brainwashing in Russian kindergartens, primary schools and secondary schools as well, on their own native populations.
Yeah, and what we are, that there are several movements, propaganda movements. There are different names of it. The movement of the first and some other of them, where they actually. It's like the pioneer movement, of the Soviet Union, where they tell that it's very important that they live in Russia, that they have to respect Russia, the state, to be patriots of the country, and so on and so forth. So they start from the very young years to put these very specific ideas, like to children's minds, and you're quite right saying that it's like everywhere, and I think that this is a strategy. We in these terms we have to kind of like the whole world should be thinking about how to, and I know that a lot of people and a lot of medias are fighting with this disinformation or propaganda, but we have to kind of learn how they do, because they are making it very soft, and then people are following it. That's the main problem, that it's very subtle, and in the majority of cases it's not very subtle, but it works. So I just wanted to even ask you, how do you think, how does it work? Why does it work? Because
well, I had this,
as far as
I think it does. It works on many different levels. You may be familiar with her work, but Olga Tokaryuk is an independent Ukrainian journalist, and she's actually in Oxford, down the road from me. And we had this conversation, I think, on 2 occasions on the channel and at many events since then. And you spot the obvious stuff, and people will spot the obvious stuff and label it as propaganda. But that isn't to say that's the only kind of narrative. It's almost like they throw spaghetti at the wall, and there are narratives of different levels of sophistication. There are mythologies designed for everybody, for every taste. So if one piece of propaganda doesn't get you, you may well fall into the trap of repeating another form. And, as we were discussing before we switched the camera on, I watch an awful lot of material, not very much actually from the BBC and CNN, but occasionally I'll dip in and listen to some of that stuff. And even amongst, seasoned politicians who've been in service for decades, or diplomats in the West, or correspondents, you'll listen to them. And even though they are ostensibly pro-Ukrainian and they think the war is terrible, you will hear certain mythologies, certain ideas repeated as if they were fact, when in actual fact, they ought to be challenged and questioned. And one of those, of course, is that this is Putin's war, that somehow, if Putin is going to be deposed or killed by his elites, that will fundamentally solve most of the problem. I tend to think that it's in no way the case there. And one of the important facts that you mentioned from your research is that soldiers on the ground, far from just being conscripted morbiki, far from being just sort of forced into the situation. Maybe they prefer not to fight. Maybe they might have wanted to get out of the country, but actually they still have the ideas of the Russian Imperium. They still have, a whole toxic mixture of narratives going on in their heads, which has been created by the propaganda machine.
I quite agree with you. And, I'm just thinking about these toxic narratives you are talking about. I'm sometimes thinking, but like people can go log in the internet and read some other information. Like what is going on with critical thinking? And sometimes here we have talks with different people who are exploring and researching the Russian propaganda narratives. And we have these discussions, why is it happening? And I have a theory that it's just the whole understanding of the state and of the country. So imagine you are living in an authoritarian regime. So you are not given these freedoms. You are not given these freedoms of speech, freedom of information, freedom of media, and you kind of get used to it. You are getting used to it. You are living in this reality, and then it should be like a great courage, a big courage, to accept the fact that the country you live in may be different. It's like the ruining of all your values, of everything. It's like a base. So you have this base, and it's ruining. Imagine, it's very hard to go through it psychologically, even mentally. So that is why a lot of people just choose to believe in what they are forced to believe, because in other way they have to look at this world differently, which causes the change of the mentality of their attitude to the world and everything. And imagine, like, have you ever thought of the idea, why is it so that people are sad that it's like the Western world is against, the whole Western world is against of them, all the world is an enemy, so it means that the only safe place on the planet is Russia. And I'm sometimes thinking, why is it so? But it's just easier to live like in a world like that. So you just explain that the whole world is an enemy, everyone is an enemy, and only here you can feel yourself safe, in safety, even though that you're suppressed, And it's a great, actually, sometimes I'm just like digging there and thinking about that, like how to work, because this is what we will have to work with people who are there. And we need to explain all the things, but why is it so that the amount of people who are ready to get this critical information, critical thinking information or other information is just not very high.
And I don't think you'll be able to replace these toxic mythologies with other mythologies or untruths. And I think even facts are only going to make very slow progress to reversing the process of brainwashing. And again, there's an impression here that it's only Putin and the elites that are saturated with these imperial desires. And my own experience of talking to people in Russia suggests that that's very far from the truth, that these ideas and mythologies actually tap into something that is quite deep within a lot of people's psyches. And even if they don't take action on those, it's part of this mythology they've built up for themselves. So I think that's very difficult to kind of tackle. And I don't think necessarily a standard political solution by just replacing a regime or replacing a leader is going to work. I think it requires a far more fundamental root and branch change. I know a lot of people have been talking about decolonization, which is the political aspect of it. But actually, I think it's far more fundamental, which is you will only get emergent democracy in Russia if you break up people's mythologies into smaller units. If they can get the mythologies from the family, the village, the town, the city, even the oblast they live in, rather than these huge national geopolitical narratives, that's the way to sort of chip away at it.
Interesting. Yeah, well, hopefully we will see when it will happen, the main question, when
and if. I mean, yeah, it's difficult to know what kind of change is going to happen. Another aspect of it, and I think this, because of the work you do and the sort of organization you're part of, I think this is a fascinating aspect of it as well, because these mythologies don't just exist in Russia. You also have Kissinger, you have Mearsheimer, you have, various geopolitical experts in the West who I think also have a certain worldview. They've got a construct of how the world works, and despite evidence to the contrary, they don't want to give up the ideas that helped make their jobs easier, which perhaps were true sort of 20, 30, 40 years ago during the Cold War. So these mythologized ways of thinking are not just confined to Russia. The idea of, unipolar or bipolar world, multipolarity, and all these sort of big concepts that we know the propagandists use. I also think there are some Western pundits who actually quite like the idea where it was, the West versus the East, Russia, Washington versus Moscow. It's a simpler concept to grasp rather than the scary sort of chaotic interpretation of a mafia-run kleptocracy, or genocidal kleptocracy, which is what Ukraine is facing.
I completely agree with you. And our problem is that, you probably heard it from a lot of Ukrainians who you interviewed, that, we are in a position that we are fighting for our existence as a nation. And we are also fighting for the whole Western world and its values, because, if someone wanted to be a part of Russia or to be Russian, it was not a problem. You can just buy a ticket and go by train and just live somewhere where you wanted to live, And as you know, they were like people who worked in Russia, and it was not a problem. It has never been a problem, But when we got this absolutely unprovoked and brutal war of aggression on our Ukrainian identity, it's tragic that we have to go through it right now, and that someone's ideas just led to it, that we are in this position. We are losing a lot of people today, and we don't know when it will be over, what is more tragic.
I mean, let's turn back to the report you did, because I think what really got my attention was the I think sort of fascinating stories that emerged from that. And of course, some of them are very uncomfortable to discuss, which leads on from what we're talking about, which is going outside your comfort zone to try and really hear the voices of individual people and their experience, rather than building your conception of the world from sort of abstract top-down approach. During the conversations you had, you must have got an impact on the psychological and physical impact of occupation on people. Can you sort of describe that? I know it's probably a huge range of different experiences, but how's that affected people, and how long are the effects of occupation likely to impact, their emotions and psychology and behaviors?
That's a very important question, Jonathan. Thank you for that. That it depends. So if we are talking about different regions of Ukraine, the effects of the occupation will be different, because as we have talked that Crimea, Donetsk, or Lugansk Oblast that were partially occupied before the full-scale invasion, people lived under occupation there. And, it's different even in Crimea or in Donetsk or Lugansk Oblast, because in Crimea, I would say that, when I just talk to people who are there, they it depends. So some of them are, so they don't like the whole situation where they live, but they can change it. So that is why they accept it, and they are like, okay, we have to live with that. While in Donetsk or Lugansk Oblast, people are scared, and the main probably emotion or sense or feeling when you are under occupation, it's fear, because you are just you are scared for your life, you're scared for the life of your relatives, or it's just the complete. So you don't feel yourself as a free person, like on the physical level. You can just feel it, that you're just constantly scared. So it's the constant feeling of a stress that a person goes through, because there are a lot of things that it's like suppression. It may be interrogations, as you know. There are like a lot of filtration camps where people are just so at first Russia cuts this territory, then it closes it with the filtration camps on the exits or like entering of the city, and then you are asked a lot of questions like, where do you go? Do you have any relatives in the armed forces of Ukraine? Do you have anyone in the state service of Ukraine? And then it's like random questions. You never know what people are asked, and a lot of people are undergone through like interrogations, tortures. Many people would say that they don't even know where those people who went through these filtration camps. And there are a lot of situations when you probably read, even Ukrainska Pravda had a lot of stories that people went through these filtration camps, what they told, like for instance, if they had some patriotic tattoos, they were asked about that, and if someone saw it, it could be the reason for future interrogation. So it's just random things, but the whole situation is that you just don't feel as you are a free person. You know, it's just the constant impression of your identity that you cannot be the person you are, and it's the constant feeling of fear. So this is how people live, and imagine the whole situation if the person lives like that for 6 months or for 9 years. And for 9 years, people have to get used to it, because other than that, they can't survive. So it's other effects and consequences, but I can just tell you that all of us today, we are going through traumas, and for for those who are in the safer place, is the trauma of a survivor. It's a great feeling of like, I'm guilty that I'm here, you know, I'm guilty that I have survived, and like I have the feeling that every time I'm doing not enough, that I can do better, more. And for those people who are under occupation, it's definitely the PTSD in all the sense that you can go through. Those people who are fighting, it's also PTSD. So we will have the whole generation of people who will be having different psychological problems, mental problems that we will be working with. And I was at the Polish embassy event a few days ago, and even the first lady told that Ukrainian women are so that they think that we can solve it out, we can sort it out, we can figure it out by ourselves, not reaching out to psychologists, to specialists, because they think that they can go through it. But the reality is that we all need psychological support. It doesn't matter where we are, and if you're talking with the person, you probably saw it, that right in today's day, it's not okay to ask a child, where are your parents? Because if you see him somewhere in the post office, he might not have parents. How we should reframe all our questions, because the whole situation is like very personal for all of us. It's very sensitive, because parents, they can be not here anymore. And or I mean, it's I can talk for like hours about that, because I have a lot of situations. Like the other day, one of my friends, she wrote me and said that parents of her friend are in captivity in Donetsk Oblast, and that she doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know how to support her friend, because they are afraid to actually publish anything like on social media, because they are afraid that it can raise it can increase the price of this person or these people, and but they can't keep silent. So it's this situation where you have to balance and to find the right solution where there is no right solution, So it's a lot of ambiguity, it's a lot of uncertainty, and it's a lot of traumas.
And there's going to be physical injuries as well now. I mean, I know the psychological problems are not immediately apparent on someone's face, and there's the famous video, isn't there, of a Ukrainian woman composing herself for a meeting and looking sort of very together, and then it shows you before and after. And I think everyone must be going through a degree of having to put on a face and be strong for the sake of survival. But there are also going to be physical injuries, and the number of people with missing limbs, scars, maybe more serious, even more serious things, that's also going to become a really unfortunate feature of life, isn't it? And cities are going to have to adapt to the needs of a huge population of people who are perhaps in wheelchairs and have special requirements.
You're quite right, and imagine the whole situation that definitely people have physical injuries and physical injuries because of the war. They were fighting on, or they were interrogated. That is why they don't have something right now. And yeah, a lot of people, as you know, they are trying to get the the repair in terms of like in other countries, being able to like replace it with the these things,
Prosthetics,
right?
yeah, prosthetic
Yeah,
limbs, yeah.
yeah, right. But that's also the case that we have to accept this new reality, and we have to know how to deal with people who went through all of that. And it should be the great respect to all those people who went through, who defended. I literally think that all the people who are defending the country with weapon or staying in the country, they are all heroes, and we have to understand that I sometimes hear that in the States there is no institute of like respecting veterans or something, but I'm sure that we will have it, because we have the already right now we have the cases when a defender of this city was killed there, but we have the for instance, I don't know, the street name named after this person, which I think that is, at least commemorating the memory of this person who gave his life for that. But that's definitely a path we all have to go through, and we have to have this ethic norms, and it's a great work ahead, and we probably have to look at the experience of other countries. Israel, who is in constant war.
That's right. It's just the scale, of course, is going to be like nothing seen since the Second World War. And back then, there wasn't, the concept of PTSD. There wasn't an infrastructure to support people sort of psychologically and physically that now is seen as a human right, is seen as a requirement. But another aspect I wanted to touch on in the occupied territories is that, of course, there's a big difference as well, isn't there, between day-to-day life. So those are in Crimea who don't necessarily, agree with the regime. Having said that, it's been 9 years, and you're not, unless you're politically active, you're not necessarily under sort of daily threat of torture and so on. Whereas someone in Kherson, life was far less predictable. And if you survive, if you find food, if you survive, if you get through it, yes, maybe your own agency plays a factor, but actually blind chance also plays a factor in your survival. Does that feed very heavily, do you think, into the sort of survivor's guilt that you mentioned a minute ago?
I think yes, and what is more, it's just the whole situation with like Kherson Oblast, which is very interesting that you mentioned Kherson Oblast. Some of my friends who are from Kherson, they say that after the liberation, so the situation, well, like all the people from the recently liberated territories who are not there, they tell me this particular detail, and it's very important for us to understand the whole scale of tragedy there, because they say that these cities or settlements are under constant shelling every day, because it's like a revenge, because Russia doesn't want to give it up. So they, like Russian forces, shell it, they attack it even more severely than before. And that's an absolutely survival mode. People are, those people who stayed there, they sometimes take decisions to move somewhere, to evacuate from these places, even though it's a liberated territory. So that is why it's important. Like here, I'm always telling that, if the territory is liberated, it doesn't matter that everything is good there, because on the contrary, it's getting worse there, because Russia is shelling these territories, and people have to deal with like everyday needs. They need to find somewhere food, medicines, and like other very substantial goods and everything. I can tell you, even when Kyiv was in an attempt of encirclement, when we had the ruin of all the grocery chains, and meaning that they couldn't be delivered. So it's just it's like from the movies, when you just enter the grocery store. Yesterday it was full of groceries and today it's absolutely empty. It's like from the I don't know, like from the talks of your or memories of your grandparents, who would tell you how it was during the Second World War, and you're like, no, it cannot be happening. It's the 21st century, and it's like surreal, everything that is going on these territories, on the temporarily occupied or recently liberated. There is this feeling of this surreality, because it's like a other dimension. You see that this place was liberated, but still it has a lot of like damage, ruins, and everything that was very dear to your heart. You're like looking at it and now it doesn't exist, or it's ruined. It's for instance, if in Crimea you mentioned it, it's different, because, as you know, that was very important for me to know. Tamila Tasheva, the permanent representative of the president of Ukraine, she told that the full-scale invasion sparked increased repression of activists, journalists, Crimean Tatars, and ethnic Ukrainians, but the resistance movement on the peninsula has also intensified. This was something that was very important for me to understand that, and I just tried to understand why was it so. And she kept on saying that because people saw that some territories could be liberated, they felt that like for all of us who are from Crimea, this question, it's a very complex question. We all want it to be back, but like we want Ukraine regain control and everything. But everyone understands that it's a military base. We have to have a plan for that, because it's not as easy as we sometimes hope and think. So, and when Tamila told me that like this resistance movement started to be more intense, and when a lot of people before it, they would be sitting, right now they saw that in other territories or in temporarily occupied, like the resistance movement worked with this blue and yellow ribbons everywhere in the places, or with the inscriptions of glory to Ukraine, glory to the armed forces of Ukraine. It's also kind of surreal, because before it, you couldn't expect that it could happen in Crimea, and right now, when I'm like looking at these pictures of places that I used to know, and it's like, wow, it works. So it's interesting. So people really feel this hope right now, and I don't know for how long this hope will be existing, because definitely it's being suppressed, and a lot of people, there are a lot of criminal cases, like since the beginning of the full-scale invasion was 250 criminal cases or administrative cases connected with the censorship laws in Russia on the peninsula, like separately. Imagine how many of them are like in Russia or somewhere else, but like on the peninsula. So, and it's different processes, but this feeling of but we all have different feelings, and the feeling of guiltiness for those who are in safer places, like number one.
And that idea that there is resistance, that there is a campaign in Crimea, I think will come as a surprise to many people, because that's another propaganda narrative that really sinks into people's heads, that in some way, Putin's illegality, in some way, his ripping up of the world order has some tiny justification there because Crimea is Russian speaking after all, etc., etc. The reality, however, is that the economy of Crimea has been destroyed by this activity. I mean, Donetsk and Luhansk even more so, but the economy and the prospects have been wrecked. So people might be in survival mode. But it's fascinating to see that, given some small optimism, that actually there is resistance there, and it should be amplified, because it really undermines some of the Kremlin's key narratives. And that's going to become far more important if we ever get to the stage of negotiations to end the war.
That's a good question. When it will happen, because everyone says that, every war is over with negotiations, though right now it's very hard to imagine how they should look like. But I'm just I wanted to add the detail about like Crimea and like this narrative that everyone is like Russian speaking there. I mean, our generation was the generation when we had more strong Ukrainian classes, Ukrainian language classes than Russian one. So my grammar is better in Ukrainian than in Russian, even though I can speak both languages. But it's interesting how this narrative worked. That this is like absolutely Russian speaking or whatever. No, it's not true. There are a lot of people who speak Ukrainian there. I know a lot of people who are from there, they speak Ukrainian, and it's just the whole thing, how it works. We have to understand that the situation is different, because even though you probably read and heard the information about that, a lot of people from Russia were, I would put it like, deported to Crimea, or they just went to live there after the annexation. So, and it's also like a question what to do with them, because we understand that the population of Crimea who lived before the annexation, it was one population. Right now, it's absolutely different. So, and there should be the strategy how to deal with people who moved to the peninsula after the annexation, for instance, from Russia. I don't know whether you have any, friends or acquaintances. I don't know anyone who would, but it would be interesting to talk with them. Like, why did they do it? Did they come over to live there because they believed in these ideas of this Russian world, or was it just because they always wanted to live on the peninsula?
I expect many would have had financial interest to do so. And, the experience of living in Russia is you often ask yourself, why on earth would someone live in certain places? One of the places I visited was Vorkuta, which, if you know where that is, it's a little bit out of the way. And you got to ask yourself, why on earth would anyone live in a climate where you have snow cover for 9 months of the year? And then you have 3 months where it's blazingly hot with mosquitoes, and you're above the Arctic Circle. No trees grow to more than the height of your kneecap. So bonsai pine forests. And of course, the answer is political and economic, and that is that incentives are provided. Institutions are invested in, factories are invested in, because it's seen as a strategic location, a political location. And I expect almost everybody who came to Crimea, apart from maybe, a small percentage are doing it out of ideology, are doing it because they've been given a financial incentive to do so. Similarly, people who firstly supported the Russian insurrection in Donbass and Luhansk areas, I expect that when the academic research is done, it'll be shown that there are a lot of mechanisms, a lot of financial inducements, the sort of, some mafia infrastructure was actually planted in those regions, and factory owners and oligarchs were threatened and coerced to help make, that insurrection possible. So living in Russia has taught me there are no accidents and no coincidences.
Wow.
And no
So
politics
everything
either.
happens for a reason. Yeah.
Everything happens for a reason. And even if it doesn't benefit 99% of the population, there will be somebody who it does benefit, and this action is happening in their favor. And that I think will come down to it.
You know that Kherson Oblast residents who were on the occupied territories, and they decided to. So Russia is saying them. So at first it intensifies the hostilities in this region, and then it's like you can evacuate somewhere to Russia or to Crimea. So the person just doesn't have another option. He or she would probably like to go somewhere on the Ukraine-controlled territory, but he or she is not given this option, So that is why people are given, profits for living in Crimea. They are given like certificates to purchase the apartment, like of particular size. But this is what Russia is doing. Like you're saying, everything happens for a reason. So that's also the strategy to make the residents more loyal, which is the part of the propaganda too.
And if you extrapolate that onto a large scale, an interesting point, I think, that was made by Andrei Soldatov, who I was speaking to a couple of weeks ago. And that is, the West and the Western media especially have throughout this war, they should have been since 2014, but since February last year, they've been expecting some kind of popular uprising, popular insurrection in Russia. And I think obviously there isn't the sort of organic foundations for that. There is no social political factors that would have led to a Maidan. But I think there's a lot deeper than that. And that is that prior to the war, a lot of the oil revenue and money are going into a few pockets and being stolen from the top. Now, you're probably seeing a lot more of that oil revenue going into the military-industrial complex. And there are hundreds of thousands of people who are employed by it. So at the moment, a big portion of the Russian population are not feeling the pain of sanctions, are not feeling the pain of war. In fact, there is an economic benefit to them from the war in the sort of factories and infrastructure that they are supporting. So again, what seems to be a political explanation for everything, it means that there are financial economic incentives that underpin this huge set of injustices, which it's very difficult for the Western mind to understand why Russians don't rebel. And I think it's complex.
It's complex, but you're quite right, because from what I'm seeing from social media, people are living their previous lives, or they are trying to live their previous lives, even though they say that they are against of the war. They don't do anything. Saying that they are against of the war doesn't make any change. And the problem is that people just accept the reality that they live in, because that is something we've already discussed, that it's just hard and painful to accept the new reality where your state is doing something wrong. But with all of that, I'm just thinking, what should be done, or how do you see the change of the whole situation? Because this is something that we expect, that people may change the whole situation in Russia. But do you believe in it?
I mean, first of all, I don't think it's, and this is many Ukrainian speakers have put me right on this, so I'm repeating their words rather than mine. It's not Ukraine's responsibility to change Russia, or even to worry about Russia's future. So I think, the best thing Ukraine can do is defend itself, eject Russia, and work on its own civil society, which is what most Ukrainians, want to do anyway. There's absolutely no desire to become, an imperial power and behave like Russia. So first of all, I think almost like, screw Russia is the attitude there. And I think Ukrainians are absolutely right to sort of say that. And one of my questions I'm going to come on to in a minute is the question of corruption, how Ukrainians are fighting for that. But I think there is an onus in the West. We can't just say, Russia has nothing to do with us, because, and the previous speaker I had on the channel goes into this in some detail, our financial system has been an enabling factor of Putin's regime. We have greased the wheels, allowing his oligarchic kleptocracy to actually exist. So there is an onus on the West to try and understand how we can help resolve the situation in Russia. And I think in particular, this channel was created to understand how Ukrainians have been liberating themselves from the post-Soviet space, and see if there are lessons within that that could perhaps be extrapolated into Russia. I don't have an answer to that yet, but this is what the channel's about. It's about exploring what those kind of methods or mechanisms could be to ensure that Russia goes through its own period of Maidans and reforms itself.
I agree with you, and it's what you're saying. It's definitely we are Ukrainians in the situation that we are experiencing the attack on our identity right now. So that is why we have to defend it at first. And you're quite right. And what people are saying, I would put it like that: we don't have time, energy to change or whatever. Like Russia, it's right now we are in a totally different situation. The main thing for us is to repel the Russian forces from all our land and to come back to our borders. And then we have to build our democratic society. That is what we have to do, and it's a lot of work.
And that leads me into the question I wanted to ask around that, because there's a brilliant quote that I got I think from either your LinkedIn or Twitter, and that is that Ukrainians aren't dying for a corrupt future. And in fact, that Russia's full-scale invasion has actually changed somewhat how Ukrainians are willing to approach corruption and corruption scandals, rather than kind of, indifference and helplessness. Which never is the Ukrainian way, but you know what I mean? There was a certain level of tolerance for corruption, seeing it as just part of life. There now seems to be far, far less tolerance, and there seems to be an idea that the future has to be better than the past.
We all hope for that, and right now we all have this zero tolerance for corruption, because we understand that a lot of people are dying for our country, for people, and we don't want these scales of corruption to exist anymore. And you're quite right, we've seen them before, all these scandals. As a journalist, there is like this tradition: we talk about some scandal for 3-5 days, then there is another one, then we talk about that. But I just want to tell you that it's not that we have some issues with corruption, but we have a lot of authorities who have to work with this, who have to tackle this corruption. It's not that other European countries don't have it. I just want to put it like correctly, because right now it's very important to like show our country that we are definitely fighting for our identity, and we are fighting for the new country. And that is why we all see that there are like even consequences in terms of like these scandals that happened in January and February, that for instance a lot of people, suspected officials, were dismissed. Law enforcement facilities served a statement of suspicion. Courts imposed measures on suspects, like they were like several months of detention or 10 million bails. So we see some consequences. Then Ukrainian officials are not allowed to leave the country unless they are on official business trip. And we are still waiting for example, for the electronic declaration system to be restored. They were like the issue with it. But we see that there are actions, but we just want to see the particular like court decisions, which will be very important. So for me, as a journalist, as a citizen of my country, it will be a great index when we will see the court decisions, and when we will see that those people who were suspects, because we have, people are innocent unless the court said that they are to blame for that, right? So that is why it is just important to understand that when we will see these court decisions, and when we will see the future actions, it will be very significant for us to understand that we are living in a totally different country.
I've got just 2 more questions, because I know we're running sort of short on time now. And one of those is about the lessons of resilience. So turning to this idea that Ukraine has been innovating various methods to resist Russian propaganda, to tackle corruption, to tackle oligarchy, to develop a sort of more of an SME-based middle-class economy and a high-tech economy. What's your view on what the lessons of Ukrainian resilience are? What has really worked to help drag Ukraine out of that post-Soviet space, and I think is now apparent to everybody, evolve a far more complex and humane society than Russia's been able to do?
That's a very brilliant question. Thank you for that, Jonathan. I think that the whole world is just observing how we are defending our country, our identity, and that's the main thing, that we are doing it because we understand that this is our fight for existence. That is what makes us super resilient. We understand that it doesn't matter where we are right now. You know that there are like a lot of people who are not in the country, but they are also fighting on their own front. This is because we all understand that if we don't do it, then there is a great threat that we will just exist in a year or in 2 or whatever. So that is why it's I would say that it's like our national trait right now, that everyone, like, look, if you look through our Instagram accounts, you will see that a lot of people are fundraising money for something. It's not that we don't have money, it's just we need a lot more, That is why everyone, it's national trait. You know that this person, this is your person who you used to work with. He's near Bakhmut right now, or Soledar, or any other intense spot of the front, and you just can't go past him and pretend that it's not about you. It's all about us right now. That is why we are fundraising money. We are helping as we can. You know, like it's just the other day I looked at my colleague, and he was like writing with another charity organization asking to send some medicines to Kharkiv, which is very hard to do right now, but still they have like a lot of shortages, and it's everyone tries to do how we can. So that is why what makes us resilient, I think that this ability to understand that it's all about us, that it's our fight for existence, and that you know, there is no other option. That is why, and we are just hoping that we can do that. Imagine people are staying without power, without electricity, but they don't want to surrender. That is also a you know, an index that people understand that we went through a lot of difficulties. If we could go through them, and if we understand that this is a marathon, we can't just give up. Because
and Zelensky's
yeah,
speech perfectly captured that, didn't it? You know, without power, without you, you know,
and like imagine people are suffering a lot, but no one wants like, yeah, hey, let's finish it. No, we want it to be finished, but we want Russia to be accountable for that, because it was not our, I mean, that is why, you know, this narratives, it's their war in Ukraine. It's I don't like it when people say Ukraine war or Ukraine conflict. I mean, what are you talking about? It's Russia's war in Ukraine. So that is why it's also important to understand. And I think that this is the constant feeling, is that it's all about us, and that if we just give up and say that, you know, I'm just too tired to run this race, then some other 100 people will say the same. So it's our unity that we support each other. It doesn't matter where we are, we will be doing and helping each other. And that is why we're asking the whole world, please help us, because we cannot be in this fight alone, because we are smaller, you know, like Russia is bigger, but we just want to keep on fighting. And I'm sure we can find it, we can defend our country.
And the last question follows perfectly on from that. And, you know, neither of us are sort of military analysts, but the question is really coming back to Crimea and the amazing story you told there about sort of resistance. Now, Crimea is the hugely symbolic prize of Putin. If he was to lose Crimea, would that be a significant moment for potentially the end of the war, but also the downfall of his regime? So much rests on that symbolic prize of Crimea.
I agree with you, but you know, only military probably experts can say you more on that, because it's military based. We have to understand that. So like as a Crimean, I can tell you something about strategy, that it should be soft in terms of like Crimean people who lived under occupation for many years, and many of them are simply afraid for anything that is not like they got used to. Even though there are a lot of pro-Ukrainian people who stayed there, still it should be like very interesting and soft strategy. But as you know, Ben Hodges, in his article, he explained that Ukraine's path to victory runs through the peninsula, that its liberation should begin by targeting lines of communication and logistics infrastructure to isolate Russian forces. And also he said that the liberation of Donbass, for instance, won't significantly change the strategic situation, that liberation of Crimea would be such a monumental defeat for Russia. But we all understand that it's a symbolic meaning. But on the other hand, all the countries understand that it was illegally annexed. So we have to deal with the, you know, we have to go and liberate all the territories, and all Ukrainian territory should be restored to Ukraine, including Crimea and Donbass. We know it. So that is why there should be the strategy, which is I'm sure, being prepared by the military personnel, by the analysts who know what is going on the ground. I mean, I could talk, but I'm not an expert in the military operations. That is why I'm just telling you that I agree that if we don't do that, this territory is used for targeting our critical infrastructure, for targeting the rest of the territory of our country. That is why there should be something, right? There should be the decision, the solution for it. And but definitely we can't get inside of the Putin's head and understand what he will be doing, but we have to think about that. But how? That's probably, policymakers and very respected people of this world are thinking about it right now. I'm sure, I'm truly believe that it's possible, that it's not an easy way. It's not, it's going to be it's a complex problem, and it's a complex situation. It's a complex strategy, should be like, I mean, related to Crimea, but everything is possible, because when we are, when we are being attacked by Russia and we are still resilient, I can tell you that everything is possible.
I think, if anything, the last 12 months has shown us that if anyone can do the impossible, it's Ukrainians. And I know we're out of time. It's been a huge pleasure speaking. I know we've been sort of conversing for some time to set this up, so it's brilliant that we finally got to sort of talk about these. And we're going to put a link to the article that we mentioned at the start about the impact of the invasion on the occupied territories, the different occupied territories, and the various experiences and testimonies that you got from people. So the link will be in the description. And all I can say is, Elina, thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Yeah, and see you in Kyiv or in other Ukrainian city.